Thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and celebrate with Mark his 60th birthday. I'm going to be talking today about a project on reinforced diffusion as a model of memory-mediated movement. The collaborators on this project are my PhD student, Frank McBride, and Leonid Korolov, who is a probabilist at the University of Maryland, the math department. And this is one of his first forays into the realm of applied math. So it's a little bit interesting to introduce him to some of the kind of things that we were working on and interested in. So I want to start off by mentioning that a lot of the work that I've been doing on memory has been heavily influenced by my interactions with Mark. In particular, I want to point to two workshops at the Banff International Research Station, where I was really privileged to work with Mark and just benefit from his leadership style and very engagement in the work that we were doing. These led to the two review papers that were mentioned earlier in Paul's talk, but really it was very informative and sort of transformational in terms of introducing me to these concepts that I really wanted to start paying attention to, and they had a very long-lasting influence. But these are not the first interactions that I had with Mark. My interactions with Mark go back to 1993. He probably doesn't remember the first interaction, but it was very influential for me. And so I want to relate that very briefly. Mark did a PhD, did his postdoc rather, with Peter Kariva, who was my PhD advisor at the University of Washington. And Mark and I never overlapped. And so when I first got there as a young PhD student, I didn't know Mark. I was very new to the whole area of mathematical biology and applications to ecology. But I had this set of field data on movement by praying mantises. And so I was listening to some of Peter's conversations, and I got the idea that I could actually estimate a diffusion coefficient from field data. And so I did a whole bunch of work on this, and Danny Grunbaum helped me with some of the mathematics for it. And so I wrote up this paper, and I submitted it to Ecologia, and it was soundly rejected. And so at that point, I said, well, okay, I'll just work down the food chain of journals. And so I started moving down the ecological food chain, and I got faster and faster rubber bouncing packages from the journals. Back in these days, this was before you could submit a manuscript online. Everything was done through the mail, and these were in fact rubber envelopes that would come back very quickly from the journal. And so I was getting increasingly desperate, really starting to wonder whether I had made the right choice in life to pursue this kind of stuff, and whether I had any business being in graduate school, frankly. And so Peter told me, well, I should actually go up the food chain. And so he said, just add a little bit to it and send it to ecology. And it turned out that the reviewer on the paper was Mark, and he signed his name. And he had all these encouraging comments and very helpful ideas. And at that point, I actually went and looked up who he was, because it was a new experience for me. And it was actually very influential in keeping me connected to this area of research in spatial ecology in particular. It's had a very long-lasting influence on what I do. So thank you, Mark, for starting me off and staying with me all this time. And what's that? I remember the You do? Okay, so you do remember. Okay. I'm really surprised by that. It had a big influence on me, but it was just a review. But in any case, this is a very long-winded version of saying that if you don't like what I'm going to talk about, just blame Mark, because the ultimate fault lays with him in keeping me in this whole thing. So I'm going to talk about memory and the role that learning and memory can shape movement. And some really interesting work in this area has been done on homing pigeons by Dora Biro and her colleagues. And so these are maps of the flight trajectories of homing pigeons. And so a homing pigeon is released from some start location, and then it moves back and flies to an end site. And so they did this on a 10-kilometer route, and they gave the pigeon 20 training flights. And the final 3 flights are highlighted in blue here. And you can see that there's a systematic reuse of the flight paths. And so as the animal gets more and more experience and more memory in navigating this homing route, there's very low variance in what it's doing. And also interesting, the learned routes are not the most efficient. It takes a big detour here rather than going straight to it. The red curves here are what happens if the same pigeon is released at different locations. And you can see that even though it's initially displaced, it eventually moves back onto the established homing route and follows that in to the endpoint. And so this is very influential in thinking about how memory might influence movement. And the idea that the learned routes are not necessarily the most efficient ones. So, as Paul also mentioned, there's been a great deal of work in mathematical modeling of memory-mediated movement. Wide variety of approaches. Just a very small handful of these are mentioned here. But it's an area that has interest because it can be approached from many different ways mathematically, different kinds of assumptions that can be built in, different kind of modeling tools that can be used to ask these kinds of questions about how memory might shape movement. But one of the key results that is common to several of these kinds of analyses of memory is that there seems to be a balance between the repulsive short-term memory, so avoid where you've just been, and an attractive long-term memory, go back to where you had been previously, but have after some time lag. And so that balance between repulsion and attraction is something that shows up in several of these models. And there's another piece is that memory tends to degrade over time, that you can strengthen this memory from repetition. And those two pieces actually fall in line with what the psychologists have discovered about the role of repetition and the influences of elapsed time on the loss of memory. When you have this kind of structure with both repulsive and attractive components and time degradation and repetition in them, you can get spatial structure. And here's just 2 examples of this. One is the Van Morter paper that Paul mentioned, and more recently there's been work looking at migration using a PDE type approach where you can get movement, migratory movement, regular migratory movement with a equation system that has these components in it. So personally, one of the most influential papers for the work that I've been doing over the last decade or so has been this paper here on the stochastic modeling of animal movement. And it had a variety of contributions. It's a very nice review paper. But one of the things that really grabbed my attention in this paper was the idea of what are called reinforced random walks. And this is one starting place for how you might model memory. The idea in a reinforced random walk is that there's some visit to an area that makes a future visit more likely, or if there's a very strong aversive reaction, less likely to occur. Traditionally, reinforced random walks operate on a grid or a network of some kind. And there's actually seen huge development in computer science in the context of machine learning approaches. But Smaus et al. Made the comment that these models need to be extended to accommodate opportunities for distant, remembered locations to influence movement. And so that led me to work in the continuous time, continuous space equivalent of reinforced random walks, which are called reinforced diffusions. And turns out this topic is relatively open mathematically. Our probabilist was very interested in this because there's not a lot of strong theory underneath this body of work. But these are continuous time, continuous space models. They don't have any kind of grid or network to them, and they're written as stochastic differential equations. So in words, this is what the model that I'm going to talk about includes. So at time t and some location x of t, the animal's direction and speed of movement are governed by several different components. The first of these is a drift term. And this drift term is a function of the animal's current location. This can be a gradient following piece. It could be some kind of a attraction to a central place, like in a simple Ornstein-Uhlenbeck kind of model. And then you can have a more complex piece, which is the memory term. And the memory term is a function of the animal's past track. Mathematically, this is going to be a line integral through a vector field. But basically, what it represents is that there's some tendency to reuse past tracks while avoiding recently visited places. And so these two pieces, the drift and the memory, together determine the directionality of the movement. But there's also a noise term that's part of this mix. So in pictures, what this means is that we have our animal, and this is the only picture of the animal in my talk today, is that this little fox is going to have some tendency to drift towards its central place. That's the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck central tendency kind of idea. The entire path is going to have an influence by influencing a net vector for movement. So each point along this path is going to have a contribution, and there, you can build into this an aversion or attraction component, and you can also have both space and time, including the opportunity for time decay. And then there's going to be also a component due to noise. And the combination of all three of these pieces leads to the ultimate next vector at the next point in that continuous movement path. So mathematically, what this means is that we can come up with a generic stochastic differential equation. In a very simple form, it would have this kind of a structure here. In this case, x of t is in 2 dimensions. It's a continuous time stochastic process. And here, w is just a 2-dimensional Brownian motion. We want to build some complexity into this. And so we can add directionality. So when we add directionality, we have this term here, b of xt, which represents the different pieces that can influence movement in a non-random way. So a very simple form here would be an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck movement where you've got some attraction to a central place. But we can expand on that, and we can structure it with a non-Markovian form. And so when we do this, we replace those functions a and b with mathematical objects called functionals, which I was interested to learn about. But the idea is that these functionals then give us a way of representing the past influences. And here u is an index into elapsed time. And so the coefficients then depend upon the trajectory of the process up until time t. And you can simplify this in different ways. And for example, you could have the noise dependent on itself. But for our purposes, we looked at the case over here where b is the one that has the dependence on past time. So building this directionality functional, we can throw in the 2 pieces that I've introduced earlier, the idea of a central place attraction. That's over here. This is the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck piece. But then there's this term here, memory. So this is the line integral I was mentioning, that it integrates from time 0 up to time t, and then it has several pieces in it. The first piece is t of s inside this integral, and that's the time component. That's the memory weight due to elapsed time, and that function can have a couple different aspects to it. You can build in both the attraction and the repulsion as a function of time, so this can represent the kind of idea of time since last visit that was introduced by Uli Schlegel and Mark in an earlier paper, and is also showing up again in a poster here by Peter Thompson and Mark. And so this time component here captures that aspect. And then the next piece over is the spatial attraction. And so this can represent not just, this is a way of decomposing the time in the space pieces. And what this represents is that there's a spatial attraction or repulsion from the current point relative to some distant, previously visited path element. And so the functional form here is shown here for u of d, d being distance. It has to have these simple constraints in place, but the basic idea is that the places that are farther away in space have less influence. And so the functional form that we chose to use has this shape to it here. We call this a logistic inverse function. I'll be happy to show this to you earlier later if you'd like. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is this part up here at the top, where u of d is equal to 1 out to some distance. And we call that the immediate surroundings. Beyond that immediate surroundings, there tends to be some decay in the influence of space. But if you're within those immediate surroundings, then space has full influence, and the animal can use all of that information to make its movement decisions. I'll point out that you can include a response to resource within this structure by another term. Here we have a piece for resource tracking. I'm not doing that here in this talk or in the paper that goes along with this, but it's possible within this framework. So that brings us to the numerical side of this, because when you write an equation like this, the typical way of exploring it is numerically. There's not a lot of analysis platform on which to build with this kind of a model. But what we did was we assumed an exponential function for the time decay. We assumed this logistic inverse function for the spatial piece. And then in this numerical solution, the animal could move in cardinal directions, but we had 10,000 time steps, small time steps per time unit. And then depending on the behavior of the model, we ran this out to as few as 10 or as long as 300 full time steps. This takes a lot of time on the university's high-performance computer. They sent me a couple nastygrams in the process of doing this. But it's well worth it, I think, and especially because it can be simplified from what we did for the purposes here. Just to remind you, if you have a Ornstein-Uhlenbeck kind of motion that has central place attraction and noise, but no memory, you get this kind of a structure here where the animal's path is wandering around. It's spatially bounded, and it has this attraction to a central place, but it's just a big wandering mass, and it's different than pure diffusion, but it's also not particularly interesting from the standpoint of an animal's movement. Where things get interesting, though, is when you build in a memory piece. And so with memory, you get 3 qualitatively different behaviors to this kind of a model. The first of these is that you get a distribution. And so these different panels here represent different time slices from early in the model to late in the model. So this could be right after the animal is introduced into this landscape. It kind of wanders around, looping around, and that behavior persists all the way through the end of the model. It doesn't change. We ran this way out, and it never collapses. It doesn't do anything other than just have this looping and the structure to it, and we call that a distribution. But under certain parameters, you can get a very different behavior in which this looping behavior collapses to what we call an attractive point. Now, it's not truly a point because this is a stochastic model, and you have some limited motion around that point, but it is a very different behavior than seen up here. It's a true collapse spatially, and it can happen quite quickly depending on the parameters. And the third and most interesting of the qualitative behaviors that we observed is what we call a cycle. And so here, the animal's movement starts off looking like this, and over time, it actually stabilizes into a cycle that just repeats endlessly. And I'll point out that this kind of cycle can be complex. It can have these little locations where you have more than one path connecting elements of the cycle to each other. And I'd also point out that this pattern is something that is developed in a homogeneously structured space. There's no spatial structure to this except for this central place of attraction. The rest of the behavior is due to memory. And so if we look across parameters, and so this is all new if you saw some of this talk in England earlier this year, we can actually characterize how these 3 different qualitative behaviors depend upon parameters of the model. So the 4 different panels here represent different levels of noise. The y-axis represents whether you have an attractive component on the time term in that memory functional, or whether it's an aversive component. The black bar is when the attraction and the aversion are balanced. And then on this axis here is the breadth of that distance function for the spatial memory U. So this is how big the immediate surroundings are that I was mentioning earlier. And you can see that there's 3 different colors here. These represent the 3 qualitatively different behaviors. The cycles are in blue, the distribution kind of behavior is in this magenta color, and the fixed points are up here in yellow. And so as we increase the noise, we can see that the boundary between these different behaviors tends to shift to the right, but it persists. But all 3 models, all 3 behaviors persist in different settings. And so that's where that piece ends. And then what we wanted to do was to apply this to a particular system. And in particular, we thought what we could do was try to see if we could emulate what was observed with the pigeons. And so this is our model of the pigeons. They're released from this point in the blue triangle, and they go to this homing location in green circle. And then when they get there, they get teleported back to the triangle. They have to do it all over again. So this is like the researchers that would truck the pigeon back and release it again, but we're just giving it the mathematical equivalent of teleportation. And so what I'm going to show you is a series of 3 tracks that the pigeon has flown from the triangle to the circle in one scene, and then I'm going to run a little simulation that shows how that changes. So there's the 3 tracks, and you can see that they diverge in terms of the route that the pigeon took, but then watch what happens over time. Well, that's not what's supposed to happen. Yep, I got one more slide. Where is my image? Why is this not running? There is a, okay. All right, in any case, what happens when this works is that these 3 routes consolidate to a path which is not linear. It's a curvilinear thing, showing again that the paths taken by the animals are not the most optimal ones or the least costly ones or the least direct or the most direct ones. They actually follow some path that is previously established. And the other part of this simulation, which I would like to show, is how quickly this establishes that this kind of a structure where you're moving from one place to another, this consolidates very, very quickly. Just a few events repeated lead to a consolidation of the route that looks basically like what those pigeon maps were showing. So we've got some traction here. This is sort of our first foray into this kind of work. I think it has some promise with sufficient refinement and some modifications. I think there's lots of things that could be done with this. I've come to terms with the nastygrams from the computing folks, but we have lots of opportunities there. But there is another piece here I want to mention. This is a point of mathematical interest that some folks might be interested in. That if we look at this integral here, or this curve that represents the weight on the temporal memory term as a function of time in the past, it has attraction components when it's above 0 and aversive components when it's below 0. And it looks to us from the numerics that the balance between these 2 pieces of this integral seem to determine and separate the bounded wandering from the other behaviors that we found with the model. So mathematically, there might be something of interest here to try to understand more rigorously what's going on by looking at the relative balance of these 2 subintegrals. So with that, I'm going to end here. Some future opportunities are things like what happens if we look at memory that does not depend on both time and space, but only depends on time or space. What kind of results do we see then? We'd like to consider explicit resources that might add to some biasing of the movement in the directionality term. And I think that this also leads to some opportunities for modeling the behavior of animals that are migrating or that are moving according to what the behaviorists called waypoints and landmarks. So these would be fixed objects within a movement landscape that influences an animal to change its direction or to help it guide from one step to the next. With the kind of model that we've built, we think we could build in these kinds of waypoints and landmarks explicitly, and then see what happens after that. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for the invitation, and I'd be happy to take any questions.